Hi, it's Morgan and welcome to the Dove's Nest. In today's video, I'm showing you all of the books that we read this week in Tot School. Now our themes this week, for religion, we studied I Can Pray to Heavenly Father. For our language development visuals and phonics, we studied the letter A. For numbers, we focused on the number 1, even though we're sort of learning all of the numbers, but our focus this week was on the number 1. For science this week, we finished our study of the human body and all about me, and we studied the circulatory system, blood, and organ systems, specifically the heart and brain. So that was really fun. Our color of the week is the color blue, and our shape is a square. So those are kind of our overlying themes that you will notice in all of the books that we chose to read this week. So what I'm going to do now is flip the camera around and just sort of show you a little bit more in depth what we read this week. Okay, so our first theme this week, as I mentioned in our religion or gospel study or Bible study, is I Can Pray. And so we are learning about Daniel and the lions and how Daniel prayed to be protected from the lions. And so my son's actually read this book a few times. We got this in a set off of, I want to say Groupon. It came with a whole set of Bible stories and we just love them. So we're going to be reading this one. Next, we are finishing up our color red for the month for our shapes and colors theme. And so I just have this one book here, The Big Red Barn. Now, if you haven't read this book before, I think in these book reviews, I'm actually going to start doing them at the end of the week instead of before. That way I can give you a quick little synopsis about each book. So The Big Red Barn is really cute. It's just a little rhyming book, and it kind of talks about all of the things that go on around the farm. And you can look for the little animals or the different little things it talks about. You can practice counting. We had so much fun with this book. It was really sweet. This next book here is called The Dot, and it kind of, I'm gonna say loosely, goes with colors. I thought it was gonna be like a color mixing book, but it ended up not really being a color mixing book. But anyway, this book is about a little girl named Vashti, and she is feeling frustrated in class because she doesn't know how to draw, and so she kind of throws a fit a little bit and puts a dot on the paper, and the teacher asks her to sign it, and so she comes to school the next day and the dot is hanging up behind her in her classroom at her seat. And so then she's determined to make a better dot. And so she starts to mix all of the paint colors. And then she gets a little art gallery and she meets a little boy who's also frustrated that he can't draw. And so she teaches him a lesson. So there's a little bit of a perseverance story there, some color mixing, and then part of what's going to go on with our science units, which I will get to in just a minute. We are finally starting with the letter A for our letter of the week, Abeka curriculum. And so letter A for our animal alphabet friends is actually Alligator. And so we are reading a bunch of books about alligators this week. We have this one here called Alligators All Around an Alphabet. And it's just a very silly things that alligators do with every letter of the alphabet. So this one was a really fun little book. Alligator Sue, you guys, we didn't finish. We started reading this one, and it's about this little girl who lives, kind of in the swamp, but you can just see it was so content heavy. I think we got through this page, and my son, he was kind of over it. And so anyway, it's about a little girl, and she ends up going and living with the alligators, and I'm sure it's a really cute book. I can't tell you how it ends because, like I said, we didn't finish it. It was just too much for him to sit and listen to, especially after we just did the whole Animal Alphabet Friends card. Next, we have Alligator Arrived with Apples, a potluck alphabet feast. Now, this one wasn't just A. Again, this was a, the animals are having a potluck feast. And so it sort of talks about all of the things that the different animals, as you can see, alligator arrived with apples and allspice. but it talks about all of the different animals and everything that they are bringing to their feast. So again, it was kind of like the Eating Through the Alphabet or Eating the Alphabet book that we read last week, where it's just sort of a bunch of different foods that start with the same letter, but this one also included animals. So also on our Animal Alphabet Friends cards, we have apples, and apples is also sort of the major theme that goes with our Confessions of a Homeschooler letter of the week that we added to our curriculum. And if you haven't seen that video, I will be sure to link that up here. But we got a lot of books on apples. So we have Gail Gibbons' Apples. Again, it's more of a science book, and it talks about, Johnny Appleseed and how apples grow and seeds and flowers and the different colors of apples and things that we use apples for. And so this is just a really, everything you want to know about apples, you're going to find in this book. Next, we have 10 Apples Up on Top by Dr. Seuss. This was a really fun one. We read it quite a few times. Just cute if you haven't read that one. Next, we have 10 Red Apples. This is by Pat Hutchins. This one, my kids loved. We read it for story time right before bed, at least twice every night. I thought it was super obnoxious. It's kind of like those preschool prep DVDs, if you have seen those. If not, I will create a video, or if I've already made it, I will link it up here, talking about the preschool prep DVDs and other media that we love to use to learn in our Tot School and preschool. Anyway, so this is just a really simple countdown book. And so what it is this little farmer, he wants to eat an apple. And so it starts at 10, but all of the farm animals keep coming and stealing his apples. And then at the end, he has no apples. And then his wife wants to bake a pie, but there's no apples. And then they find another apple tree. It was kind of obnoxious. I thought it was, but they loved it. So, who am I to say anything? Next, we have The Seasons of Arnold's Apple Tree, again, another one by Gail Gibbons. And this one is nice, again, because it talks about the seasons. This is a really just light and soft introduction into the seasons. You have your apple blossoms, then you get the fruit, and you can go pick the fruit, and then the leaves fall, and you harvest the apples. And it was just a really nice introduction to seasons, because that's something that we haven't started talking about at all yet, and something that I actually made a note and added at the end of the year of our curriculum that I really want to talk about is the different seasons. Then we have How Do Apples Grow by Betsy Maistro. And again, this is just another little science-y book talking about how the flowers are pollinated, and then from those flowers the petals fall and the fruit forms and has seeds, and then you can plant more trees and the different kinds of apples and things. So some of these are really repetitive. This was one of those let's read and find out science books. Again, we love these books. We use them as often as we can. I've even got a couple more this week. But these are great, super age appropriate. This one was a level 2, so it was a little more in-depth and content heavy and information heavy than we were used to with the level 1, but still a really good read. But it was very, very similar to the Apples by Gail Gibbons. So I would say if you're going to get books, you probably only need one of those. Next, we're talking about Astronauts was another A theme that we had this week. And you guys, there are literally no books at my library about astronauts. There's books about space and books for older kids about, Neil Armstrong, or who am I thinking of? I'm drawing a blank on her name. Anyway, the teacher who went up in space and died on the Challenger. Anyway, but they were kind of too advanced for our Tot School. So anyway, I found this one, I Want to Be an Astronaut. It was so boring. If I'm going to be honest, it didn't rhyme. The pictures were very simple. And it just kind of talked, I guess, really about what astronauts do. They get into space, they go up, and they have their ready-to-eat meals. I guess it was boring for me because I was expecting more of a picture book with a story or a rhyme. But this was essentially what an astronaut does in a nutshell, set to these illustrations. And they're very Todd Parr-like. I mean, they're not as colorful or, kind of wildly colored, but the illustrations remind me a lot of Todd Parr books. So anyway, that was I Want to Be an Astronaut. Okay, next for our Abeka, one of the A words that we learned was ants. And so we got a few books about ants. This one was called Too Bad Ants. Now, this is interesting because it just sort of shows these two ants and they fall out of line and they get into some trouble. But it shows things from the ant's perspective as well as what they're actually doing. And so, they fall into some diamonds and they have these rocks, but then you see it's actually a spoon. And then, they're in this big brown lake and then you can see it's actually someone's coffee and, just sort of all the trouble that they get into. And it's, a mystery. Are they able to get back in with their ant group after they made some poor life choices and were sort of naughty? So again, Chris Van Allsburg, Too Bad Ants. This one was okay. Again, it was a little wordy and the illustrations didn't hold my son's attention, but maybe if you have a slightly older child, I would say kindergarten or first grade, that might be a good one. The Ants Go Marching, of course. My kids loved this one. It's literally just the song, but I didn't realize that we had never really sang this song. And so even my 1-year-old, we probably read this one to her at bedtime almost every night this last week. They loved this book. So Ants Go Marching was great. Another Let's Read and Find Out book about ant cities. And again, while these are scientific books and present scientific material as far as how in-depth it goes, they're not picture books or stories. It's still fascinating. And, it's got larger text with some smaller, bite-sized chunks of information. So it's not difficult to hold a young child's attention. And so this was actually a really good book. As always, we love these, but I thought this one was going to be a little bit too much, and it wasn't. It was great. And even when we went to the park and saw, kind of a line of ants, my son was looking for the ant hole and to kind of recalling some information that we learned about this book, Ant Cities. Lastly, for the letter A, I have a few books that don't actually have to do with the Abeka curriculum. They just start with A. So this is my husband's copy from when he was little, A Light in the Attic. And so we're not necessarily reading A poems, but I just thought it would be fun to sort of that's better, to sort of flip through and start reading some poetry. Now, while the Animal Alphabet Friends cards do offer some poetry on the backs of them, as well as in our language development visuals, there's always a poem for every card that we do, but I thought this would just be kind of another fun way to really dive into like a little poetry study. So we have A Light in the Attic. Again, his little sister stole this book and wrote all over it just to make sure everyone knew that it was hers when in fact it wasn't. Next we have Alice in Wonderland, and I think everybody kind of knows the story of Alice in Wonderland. This is actually from a Usborne kit that I have, and it's got all sorts of stories in it. So we have this, I think there's like 20 storybooks in there, and so I was able to find this, and this is great because it's kind of written Usborne style. It's not super wordy, pretty illustrations. They almost look like colored pencil drawings. So we will be reading Alice in Wonderland. And then the last thing that we have again read already, we haven't read Alice in Wonderland yet, but we read Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. And my son thought this was just hilarious. If you haven't learned, Alexander, he's just this little boy, but he doesn't get his way and nothing goes right. And everything good happens for his brothers, and it's, the worst day ever. And so he wants to move to Australia, which also starts with A. So that was great. Just a cute little classic book. We loved it. Abeka's last theme for the letter A was Africa. Okay, lastly, for our Animal Alphabet Friends card, the letter A, we are learning about Africa on Friday, about the continent of Africa. And I have so many Africa books on hold at our library, and just none of them got to our library in time. They are all still in transit. So I may have some of those books later, hopefully. But as of now, we just had this on our shelf that I had previously gotten, I don't know, either at the Goodwill bookstore or at a library sale. And it's Papa, Do You Love Me? And this book is just really sweet. It's a little boy asking, his dad, how much do you love me? And his dad goes through all of the different ways that he loves them. How much, how long, and he sort of just talks about these cultural things, sort of African culture things that sort of can help quantify the amount of love that he has for his son. And it was just really sweet, a really fun, this is like the first time we've ever talked about a continent or a country other than our own. So just a really fun introduction to geography. We were able to sort of pull down our maps and find the continent of Africa and see where it is in relation to where we live. And so this just got me really excited because next year we are doing an entire study of the continents. And so this was just really fun. We'll probably be reading it again next year, but this was a great one. Moving right along. For math this week, we are talking about the number 1. And so I got Dr. Seuss's One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish. Last week we went kind of heavy on the math concept books with all of our Math Start books. So this week we are just sort of going to take a little break. And I realize that this isn't a full counting book, but I mean, there's really only so much you can do with the number 1. So this is just another little book of poems like A Light in the Attic. And we're going to keep getting math concept books and counting books, but it was really hard to find something that just dealt with 1 or what it meant to be 1. At least on my library search, I couldn't really find anything. Lastly, on Friday, we learned about feelings. And so we've got Todd Parr's The Feelings book here. And it is very simple, that talks about feelings with a very simple illustration so that you can talk to your child sort of about the beginning of different feelings or emotions. And so that's a very basic introduction to feelings. Next, we have the fun little Pigeon book, We Love the Pigeon books by Mo Willems. And so this one's really funny. Pigeon, meets a friend and the friend wants to see his happy face, and Pigeon, being Pigeon, says no, and then gets angry at such a request. And, that everybody's always bossing him around. And then the friend just sort of says, fine, you don't have to do it if you don't want to. And the Pigeon's happy that he won the argument and shows him the happy face. And ends up losing the fight in the end. So that's a really cute, quick, easy read. Next, we have this one here that I found on our bookshelf. I don't know where we got it or when, but it's called The Way I Feel. And what this book does, it's got these beautiful illustrations, and it sort of talks about a scenario, and then it names the emotion. So, when you're laying in bed at night and there's crashing and roaring thunderstorms, you feel scared. And so it sort of goes through all of them that way, frustrated. This is what I'm feeling when this situation happens. So that's a really good one at explaining different life situations to your children and then identifying, oh, that's the feeling that you're feeling. So this one's actually, that's going to be a really good one. Next, we have Feelings by Aliki, and this one is kind of similar to that one in that it gives you this whole scenario, almost like a little comic strip. On every page, there's different situations and scenarios, and it doesn't necessarily identify the feeling. Actually, it doesn't at all. It does a few times. I'm happy, but it sort of just gives you this little story, and then you can address the emotion and talk to your children about what the emotion is. So for example, what Tom did, oh, look, everybody's giving Tom praises. You did so great. It's wonderful. You built this tower. So obviously Tom feels happy. He feels proud. John knocked over all of the blocks, and everybody's getting mad at John. So you can see the angry so you sort of name the emotion and talk to your child about it. So this was very different than I expected it was going to be, but it was great. We loved it. We love just about everything Aliki does. Next, I got this So Many Colored Days. Now, it's Dr. Seuss and Colors, and so I was fully expecting this to go along with our colors and possibly the color red. But this actually was emotions. It was a little bit too old for my son, but we still read it. I mean, he didn't really care much for it, but it just talks about some days you have different days. You're allowed your good days and your bad days, and it sort of identifies each type of feeling as a different color. So for example, on this page, on bright red days, how good it feels to be a horse and kick my heels. So they're identifying red with the color, and it feels good and it's kind of happy and almost joyous because, you're jumping up and kicking your heels. But it doesn't actually identify the day or the feeling as being happy. It's just sort of different things. So it was different. It was a little deep, I guess you could say, a little... Oh, I don't know. I don't want to say they're not obviously like analogies or anything, but it was a little cryptic for a preschooler, I think. But it still was fine, and it rhymed, which he liked, and there was a little happy ending. So that was that. I forgot to talk about one of our books. I'm literally standing at the library in front of the book drop to talk about this book. But this one went along with our feelings and emotions, and it's called Millie Fierce, and it starts out kind of sad. It's about this little girl named Millie, and nobody really pays attention to her or notices her. She kind of just blends in with the background. And one day she decides to change that, and she, channels her inner Beyonce and changes her name to Millie Fierce. And she does really naughty things, and she's mean to everyone. And she notices that people start paying attention to her. It's negative attention, but they still give her lots of attention. And, the kids are afraid of her. And anyway, one day at school, she makes a little friend feel really bad. And then that makes her feel really bad. And so she decides that she doesn't want to be fierce anymore. And she likes being good. And for the most part, we liked it. My kids, we read it probably 5 or 6 times, and they really liked this book. I didn't like that it taught my kids, if you're not getting enough attention, you can be a jerk and you'll get more. But I know that wasn't the moral of the story. So overall, it was a good one. So that's it. Thanks so much for joining us on another Tot School adventure. Most of these books came from our home library, but we did get a few at the library. If you need something to do with your children or want them to learn but just don't have a ton of time, I strongly encourage you to read to your children. If you can, read an hour every day. You will notice huge changes in their behavior, and I mean improvements in their behavior. And then you will also notice their vocabulary begin to grow. They're questioning their earth and environment and all these things around them, their world around them. It will just grow and enhance, and there's no better way to spend quality time with your child than to read to them. So hit up your local library and get some books. As always, if you're interested in following us along on our Tot School journey, click that subscribe button, and I will see you in my next video.